basically it's false. The literary form of the first creation story is an editorial. True? Who says true? Raise your hand. You're all wrong. Does anybody remember what the form of all of Genesis, not all of Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, definitely the first 2 creation stories, they are myth. Remember the myth? As a literary form, an imaginative story filled with symbolism to teach us theological truths. And the symbolism is usually based on things that were happening at the time, things that the people of that time would have understood. So that's the first creation story. Remember how it took place during the exile? Do you remember that? Those of you that were here, it took place during the exile when the Israelites were in Babylon. And it was around 550 in the 6th century before Christ. And they were in Babylon because they had been deported, their temple had been destroyed, their businesses and homes were destroyed, and the Babylonians had invaded Israel and took them all. Okay. So they're in Babylon, they're in a strange place. And of course they became acclimated to the culture and to the stories that the Babylonians were teaching their children about how they believed the world was created. And remember, I read you part of that Enuma Elish, a very violent creation story where the father got killed and the mother got mad, and then the children decided to kill the mother, and one of them stuck a sword right through her belly, and she spilled out all over the creation. And the Israelites said, do we really want our children to learn this story as a story of God's creation? What about our God, Yahweh, back in Israel, the one that we believe is the God of goodness and graciousness? So it was around that time that this author, that we call the priestly author, wrote the first creation story, and everything. There's one God, so he's refuting polytheism. Okay, there's one God, and everything that God created was good. And everything was done in a very orderly way. There's no violence, there's no confusion, and God was in charge of it. So that's the first creation story. Do you remember a little bit about that? Now it's coming back to you? Okay. Now I'd just like to say a little bit about the second creation story, which we never got to before. That's in Genesis 2, starting with verse 4 up through 25. In that story, the writer begins with the creation of human beings. In the first creation story, human beings are created at the end of the story. In the second story, they're created at the beginning, and then the author describes how God builds up a world for this new creature. So the author actually presents 2 stories. The first is how God created one human being without any sexual identity, but saw that this earth creature, he wasn't called a man, he was called the Adama, which sounds like Adam, the Adama, which simply doesn't mean Adam. It's not a male name for a man. It means the earth creature. And God saw that this earth creature needed a companion. So God made a garden, but it was not enough for the man, for the Adama. Then he made the animals, and none of them were a suitable companion for the Adama. Finally, he made woman, and human community and sexuality were created, and that was enough. And this set the stage then for the first sin of the first human couple. So this author, he's called the Yahwist author, because Yahweh is very close to his earth creatures. He walks in the garden with them, he speaks with them, and he's represented as very close to the human beings. He thinks out loud, he works as a potter, he fashions people from mud, he breathes life into them. So there's a sense of closeness to the earth. And just as in the first story, Many elements here were drawn from common myths of the ancient Near East. The tree of life was well known in Babylonian circles as a symbol of long life or even immortality. The picture of a paradise garden was well known in some poems. The mystical power of the rivers was praised in many Babylonian hymns. So some myths tell how the first human was allowed into the council of the gods, where he was offered the bread and water of life to give him immortality, and he refused it, thinking it was a trick. So he lost the opportunity to be among the gods forever. So the theology of this Yahwist account uses all these elements from pagan myths to give a very Israelite message. Yahweh, God, begins creation with humanity and then fashions a world that this Adama and his wife are to cultivate and tend. He makes animals for them to rule over and establishes the human community of the two genders to complement one another. Human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. Male and female, the writer says, are made in the image of God. Now, the question comes up, well, what situation was this writer addressing? The priestly writer was addressing the situation of the Enuma Elish with that violent Babylonian myth. What situation was going on here? Because this story was written first, even though it's printed in the Bible second. It was written about 400 years or 300 years before the first creation story. And at the time this story was written, the various Israelite tribes had come together. There was a monarchy. Solomon was king. The conquest of the land had been completed. And for the first time, Israel had the land of Canaan under control and was very strong politically among other nations. So the structure of the society had changed. They're back in their own land. It's after the exile. Power was not centered tribally anymore, but it was concentrated in the monarchy, centered in Jerusalem under Solomon. And under Solomon's rule, there was a feeling of superiority and security because there was great wealth in Israel. Things had changed. And when the focus of life shifted, when people have plenty of money, plenty of prosperity, plenty of property, when everything is going well, what do people sometimes forget about? God, right? They forget about their religious observances. So this period in Israel's history has been described as a crisis of faith because there was an increasing tendency towards secularization. Into this context, the Yahwist writer comes, just like the priestly writer came into the context of the Babylonian myth that was so violent. The Yahwist writer comes into this period of secularization and falling away from religion, trying to bring a word of promise as well as a warning. So he composed this second creation story as a reminder to Israel that their present prosperity and their present greatness was not due to their own efforts, but it was due to God, that God was the creator of all of this goodness. And the Yahwist wants to make it clear that whatever fame Israel now has, it's because God made it possible. So he's trying to counter the tendencies of this secularized age to remove God from active involvement. And he's trying to say, no, God wants to be involved. And then in chapter 3, that's the fall. There's a vocation to take care of the earth. There's a permission to eat whatever you want, but there's a prohibition, except from this one tree, right? The story has no real interest in the character of the tree. What counts is the authority of the one who speaks, and that's God. And the expectation of obedience. Then after the sin, the story becomes a trial, and God is doing the questioning, and their speech accuses them. I heard, I ate, I was naked, so I hid. So their preoccupation with God is gone, and they're now preoccupied with I. This is the sin, the original sin, that John talks about so many centuries later in his gospel, almost on every page. The original sin is the sin of unbelief. The sin that we just talked about in the story of the man born blind. Unbelief is the inability to trust in the providence of God. The only sin in John is that sin of unbelief. And even though Jesus has freed us from it by his death, even though we all inherit it and we all hesitate to accept it. I do myself. I like to manage things myself in my own life, and sometimes in other people's, which I should stay out of. Okay? And we all do, because we don't trust that God will work everything out. But that's the original sin that we all inherit. And that is the sin that leads us to commit the sins, plural, that we all confess when we go to the sacrament of reconciliation. Nobody goes to the sacrament of reconciliation and says, I don't believe in God. If they didn't, they wouldn't be going to the sacrament. Okay? We go to the sacrament because we want to be received back into the community. God has already forgiven us if we have told him that, but we go to the sacrament to be brought back into the community that we have also offended. So the sin, the original sin that leads to all these other sins, is unbelief. And the punishment is also in there in chapter 3. It's not death, it's life, but it's life outside the garden, apart from its goodness. It's life in conflict with pain and problems. So God told the human beings in chapter 2 not to eat the fruit of that tree. If you eat from it, you're doomed to die. So everyone knows from that point on that death follows guilt. If you violate the boundaries, God says you're doomed to die. But here, when the facts warrant death, God allows them to live. God still loves his creatures. And then God does for this couple what they cannot do for themselves. He clothes them. The story tells us that the freedom we have as human persons to enjoy life and to manage creation is set in the context of the prohibition of God. What we need is trust. We need that belief, because we're all guilty of that unbelief at times. So this story it's sort of a theological critique of anxiety and unbelief. The man and woman are controlled by anxiety, and they try to escape it by circumventing the reality of God. The evil spirit told them, if you eat this fruit, you'll be like gods. Oh, you'll be wiser, you'll be smarter. Right? And so they were anxious that they wouldn't be as smart as they could be. So the sin of unbelief. According to this story, anxiety comes from doubting God's providence. But it's still hard for us to accept that doctrine of, not doctrine, to accept the idea that the only sin is unbelief, that all our sins, in the plural, come from that one original sin of unbelief that God is taking care of us. It's hard for us to accept that. But we have to keep trying. And then don't let anybody tell you that the woman is inferior to the man because he was created first. Okay. First of all, they were both created at the same time in one of those creation stories. And if you follow that logic about the woman is inferior because she was created from Adam's rib, if you follow that, then you would have to say then Adam must be inferior to the dirt because that's what he was created from. No, really, if you follow that argument to its logical conclusion, you would have to You would have to. And then he has no part in her creation. If you say, well, she was created from him, he didn't do anything. He was asleep. Okay? He wasn't a spectator when she was created. He wasn't a consultant. So he owes his life completely to God. She owes her life completely to God. So I just wanted to throw that in, just in case. Just in case you're ever in a situation. Because one time I had a young class of college students in California, and one of the young men said, well, I think the story tells that women have to be subordinate because it says, you know, that you will be subordinate to your husband now after the sin. I said, oh yes, that's our fault though, because that was the result of sin. That wasn't in God's original plan. Where do you see that in God's original plan? That a woman would have to be subordinate to her husband. So that was the end of that. But anyway, any questions or comments? Yes.
This was news to me that you're saying the second creation story came about. This would be after the return from Babylon.
Yes, because
Rather than, even though it's part of the first books of Moses, or the Genesis, so it's part of Genesis, but
no, it was. I'm sorry. I think I made a mistake. The second creation story was written about 850 years before Christ. Okay, and it was before the exile. When Solomon, they had a monarchy, and then it fell apart.
But that's still a long time.
A long
after
time.
the Exodus.
Yes. Yes.
I sort of look at the first 5 books of the Bible as kind of all, maybe Moses didn't write them all, but, it's of that era.
Yes.
Rather than either the monarchy or post-Babylon.
Yes.
So this is interesting. How did they get inserted into Genesis?
Oh, well, editors. You know, they had manuscripts, and editors would come along and edit things and then write them and then put them in order. I don't know why the second creation story is put first. But anyway, I don't know. But the editors did it. But the first creation story was written around 550 years before Christ. The first creation story. That's much later than the second creation story, which was written around 850 years before Christ. I don't have with me, I'll have to bring some next time for you. You may not have been here. I gave out a chart of the history of Israel by dates, and it has the Exodus in there.
Yeah, that's what confuses me.
Yeah.
About what you're saying about the creation stories.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well, they certainly weren't written at the time of creation.
no, thank you.
No. No. They were written much later. The first creation story was written to refute polytheism because the Israelites were in Babylon and they were learning all these Babylonian myths, and they didn't want their children to learn that violent creation story that the Babylonians taught them.
Well, and I accept that they're myths.
Yes.
But myths typically, like Greek myths and Norse myths, there's something that a long time before they're written down, they're told from generation to generation.
Yes. Yes.
Would that have been?
Well, yes, that could have been the case. They could have told it before it was written, of course. Yes. Yes, everything in the Bible was first communicated orally. Yes. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So the first Thursday in April is Holy Thursday. So we won't have the class that day, but Gigi said we can have it on April 8th, which is the second Thursday, just for that month, okay? Is that all right? Okay. Thank you, everybody.